Hey everybody, and welcome back to our lecture series. I am Ted, your host, and for this lecture we are going to pick right back up where we last left off. In our last lecture we were looking at welfare reform. We were looking at the digital revolution and the rise of the tech barons. Men such as Steve Jobs and Bill Gates came to be regarded as the reincarnation of the old robber barons like John Rockefeller and Andrew Carnegie. Bill Gates in particular continues to draw sort of like real parallels with John D. Rockefeller. Has Gates is said to have become the richest man since John D. Rockefeller, although some people still estimate that Rockefeller's personal fortune still outstripes the fortune created and maintained by Gates. I'm sorry. And of course, these men are all associated with the digital revolution, the electronic revolution, in which companies like Dell and Apple and Microsoft made increasingly and very rapid sophistication to their computer technologies, making them faster, more reliable, more lightweight, and more capable. And of course, we ended with a look at the at attempts at welfare reform, and actually a successful reform of welfare in 1996. Now, welfare reformers argued that the laxity of welfare laws to allow for an abuse of the system and a decaying of the family structure, has more and more women chose to give birth to children out of wedlock, and created a phenomena known as female-headed single-parent households. They'd always existed. There had always been women who gave birth out of wedlock in the Republic, but it had always been a very negligible amount. Bastardy and illegitimacy carried severe social stigma in the early Republic. In the aftermath of the sexual revolution, not so much. Many began to point out that this phenomenon gave rise to the problem called the feminization of poverty, which is the vulnerability of female-headed households to fall and be trapped in cycles of poverty. Sociologists now began to argue that a permanent underclass existed in the United States, whose values and cultural mores made it very difficult to aid them out of poverty. One of the major domestic policy books written during this time was Charles Murray's Losing Ground, which investigated the poverty statistics of the 1960s through 80s. Murray's conclusion was that the war on poverty was itself to blame for the ongoing dilemma of poverty in the United States. Now, Murray claimed that many of the programs created to combat poverty, like aid to families with dependent children, gave an incentive to women to not marry because they would lose their eligibility for welfare benefits. That's a very incendiary comment. That's a very incendiary view to take, and it really created a lot of divisions once it was presented. Now, the poverty programs that Murray looked at for his analysis did not take into account that while the programs were designed to alleviate poverty, were in place, they had never been properly funded or staffed. Beginning with the Johnson administration, which established the programs and first staffed them, cut their funding almost immediately due to the escalation of the Vietnam War and the rash of violent riots that closed out the 1960s, underscored the need to increase the funding to the programs and the staffing for the programs. The Kerner report argued that, and the Kerner report specifically cited that the lack of these programs and the fact that these programs were underfunded led to the Great Detroit Riot of 1967. Now, the Nixon administration immediately disregarded the Kerner report, and with that, limited or reduced the direct federal aid to poverty programs, and did all that it could to draw resources away from alleviating the conditions that have been the cause of the late riots, while also focusing on a strong showing during the Vietnam War, but before collapsing under the strain of Watergate. The Ford administration simply did not devote resources to combating poverty or increasing aid to the government programs, nor did the Carter administration. The Carter administration was more focused on foreign affairs and human rights in other countries than really at home. Carter's domestic affairs did not seek to properly fund or staff any of the poverty reducing programs, though Carter himself became a great humanitarian on the global stage. The Reagan and Bush administrations likewise bore witness to large-scale spending, but not large-scale investment into poverty relief. Murray went on to resurrect theories of scientific racism during his career in the 1990s. He charged that some races or ethnicities are just genetically inferior to others. He brought those arguments to life after they had been seemingly killed after Nazi extremism of the 1930s and the early 40s. He, for the first time, spoke about these things, and he made it a point. He made it a point in his arguments to highlight that European Americans were genetically superior in his mind, in his view, to African Americans, which created a great swarm of controversy, namely because genetic arguments like that had fallen out of favor, but also because it highlighted the centuries-long struggle for equality in this nation, and the fact that it had not been achieved in the preceding decades after the mid-1970s civil rights movement. The genetic argument made a revival during the 1990s in a number of ways. Groups like alcoholics began to argue that they were genetically predisposed to drinking, and homosexuals began to champion this argument as well by arguing that they were genetically predisposed to be gay, the concept that came to be known as the gay gene. The Republic was also driven to division over the issue of affirmative action, a remedial program from the Johnson administration. Now, affirmative action, and we discussed this at length earlier, in earlier lectures, particularly on African Americans after 1970, but the affirmative action argument was made that affirmative action was needed to improve the standing and access to education and employment for minorities who had been discriminated throughout the history of the Republic. They've been blocked from having access to education, and they've been blocked from having access to employment in favor of European immigrants. Now, through a reversal of the previous policies of the Republic, affirmative action sought to actively provide access to these to both education and employment to improve the social standing. Now, a succession of court cases challenged this policy, leading to a pronounced ruling during the Rehnquist court that interpreted the program in a more skeptical and conservative way. The decision in Alderman v. Pena led to a succession of state voter referendums that began to repeal affirmative action programs. Affirmative action itself was a very interesting study in American history. The program had been established with aiding African Americans in mind, but European American females have been the principal benefactors of the program. The African American community itself was rocked by a series of tumults during the 1990s, namely the Rodney King and O.J. Simpson trial. The Rodney King riots in wake of the beating, and of course O.J. Simpson trial in the wake of the murder of his ex-wife Nicole Simpson and her lover Ron Goldman. Now, the Rodney King scandal was one of the first documented episodes of police brutality. And this is brutality that had really gone on since the very beginning in the Republic. It harkens back to the activities that Redeemer groups would do, where they would don these hooded vestments and get to assault members of the African American community. It highlighted on the role of law enforcement in actually enforcing segregation. It harkened back to the position of a man like Bull Connor or Orville Faubus, who were proud segregationists and used all available means that included law enforcement to enforce their segregationist idea. Police officers in Los Angeles attacked and severely beat Rodney King, using excessive force, but these men were exonerated by a jury. A white jury was one lone, two I want to say. It was one lone Hispanic and one lone Asian American. And further adding fuel to the fire, the trial. The jury selection and the trial were moved from the area in which the incident happened, and where King lived, to a neighboring community, a community that was primarily European American. So they moved the venue from a predominantly African American setting to a majority European American setting. And on top of that, there were no African Americans on the jury. So it fueled a lot of fires, a lot of speculation that this had been done to ensure that justice would not be given. And one of the mottos chanted during the Rodney King riots was no justice, no peace. They could not get justice, so they would react violently. After the jury exonerated the 4 European American police officers of excessively assaulting Rodney King, riots broke out in Los Angeles amid cries of institutional racism and social double standards. Now, the O.J. Simpson trial involved a former professional American football player, O.J. Simpson. He had been a gridiron football player, first for the University of Southern California, and then with the Buffalo Bills. He had a very storied career with the Buffalo Bills, first rushing for over 2,000 yards in 14 games. I think it's like 2,003 yards in 14 games. The first player to do so. After that, he transitioned to a very successful acting career, with a lot of commercials under his belt and successful appearances in television movies and major film movies. He had been accused of the murder of his ex-wife, Nicole Simpson, and her lover, Ron Goldman. Now, the evidence supporting his conviction seemed very strong, but the lead detective on the case, a man named Mark Furman, was revealed to have had a history of falsifying evidence to secure convictions, as well as having a very prejudiced attitude toward the African American community. Furman, it was revealed, was a Nazi. He collected Nazi memorabilia, and he circled. He maintained close contact with Nazi sympathizers. During the trial, very incriminating evidence came out that illustrated that Furman had a documented history of physically abusing African Americans in police custody, and that he had a documented history of using racially and gender inflammatory language. The jury in the O.J. Simpson trial was predominantly black, and they acquitted Simpson, and this led to a sort of reversal of the Rodney King situation, in which there were cries of social double standards, and what they said that African Americans would not convict another African American, and that this was sort of an institutional preferential status for athletes and celebrities in general. Now, Simpson's acquittal led to a very, very dramatic scenes of celebration and public despair. African Americans and people very sympathetic to Mr. Simpson were jubilant in their public celebrations, and those who came to view Simpson as a killer, those who came to view Simpson as guilty. It was very public scenes of despair, very noticeable public anguish. Now, crime and punishment rates remain very high in the United States compared to other industrial nations. The United States has the world's largest incarcerated population. And many people lob the theory, or not even a theory, but they just lob the fact that it's primarily used as a population control to keep ethnic minorities from exercising power, from mobilizing, much the same way it had been used to keep Eugene Debs from mobilizing his socialist followers. They lob that it's used as a way to coerce labor and dehumanize segments of the American population. In 1994, the prison population reached over 1 million people for the first time. Another stark contrast between the United States and other industrial nations was the continued use of the death penalty. Now, the Al Qaeda attacks on the World Trade Center, and this is jumping forward into the Bush administration. These Al Qaeda attacks on the World Trade Center and the Pentagon, the attack that occurred on September 11, 2001, represented the sharp contrast in opinion of the United States, who on the one hand was respected as a guiding light in global affairs, and on the other hand detested for a host of slights, real or imagined, by peoples in various nations. The hijackers they took advantage of a number of social mores in the United States to carry out the attack. The technological advancements, and then also this sort of laxity, this sort of relaxed nature in training program, and the acquisition of weapons for people who sort of look like they could be related to the president. People with very fair complexions and sort of loose hair and so forth. They sort of took advantage of relaxed racial attitudes towards weapon acquisition and sort of explosive or even just weapon training. They carefully planned out and dedicated and putting a lot of dedication into their planning of their attacks and even their deaths, because these were suicide bombers for the most part. They planned out their deaths of the hostages, and they even planned out the deaths of the hostages, like if they were going to kill anybody just to make a point, if they were going to immediately fly the planes into targets. It was very difficult for anybody to prevent, any power to prevent. Now, there does exist, I want to say, because it is a very controversial subject, there does exist a number of conspiracy theories that profess the attacks were a government conspiracy, aided by the sitting president, George W. Bush, who allowed the attack to happen for sinister reasons. He wanted to parlay the attacks into political capital. He wanted to allow the attack to occur so that he can gain public fear credits that he could then parlay into political capital for foreign wars and repressive measures at home. President Bush, after the attacks, came to the conclusion that the United States must take a more proactive stance on foreign policy. That this new stance, along with the 9/11 attacks, led to the declaration of war against Taliban Afghanistan, and the invasion and the later invasion of Afghanistan to oust the Taliban, which defended Al Qaeda, the group that that had orchestrated and planned out the attacks on the United States. The rapid success in Afghanistan stood in marked contrast to the tedium that marked the 10-year Soviet campaign in Afghanistan. Now, the quick success was ambiguous. It was not at all clear what the leaders of Al Qaeda or the Taliban intended. It had not been clear whether they had been killed or if their terror network had been destroyed. It was later proved frustratingly difficult for the United States to create a stable, self-sufficient regime in Afghanistan. In the opening months of 2013, not 2013, I'm sorry, 2003. I'm jumping decades. In the opening months of 2003, President Bush asked Congress for a declaration of war against Iraq, and then he decided to attack Iraq. He ordered an invasion of Iraq, claiming that Iraq was manufacturing weapons of mass destruction. Throughout the entirety of the Cold War, the main plan for the Republic had been to prepare for retaliation, but not to strike first. This new policy under Bush called for the Republic to launch preemptive strikes, to make moves against potential hostile governments rather than wait to be hit by an attack. This strategy was born out of the slow-footedness of the Iraqi government to cooperate with the United Nations resolutions, as well as well-documented human rights abuses committed by Saddam Hussein. Now, the wars in Iraq, like the war in Afghanistan, were buoyed by quick early success, but quickly came to be seen as an unnecessary foreign adventure, that had the potential to become a 21st century Vietnam, that a Marshall quagmire could arouse passionate anti-American sentiments in the Muslim world, while having no exit strategy or potential for a politically stable government to take over in the wake of American withdrawal. Now, the painful lessons of the early Bush administration was that although the United States was a powerful military, with the great military power, with awesome capabilities, she could not look forward to presiding over a harmonious world, and could not enjoy popular domestic consensus about her place in the world at home. Now we will break here, and we'll come back with a final lecture, my reflection on the course. This actually concludes our lecture. I do not go beyond the invasions in Iraq and Afghanistan, because we're still fighting those wars in Iraq and Afghanistan. Where we're still fighting those wars there. We're still dealing with the ramifications of the Bush administration, the later financial meltdown, the crisis, 2008 and 2007. We're still dealing with the effects of the Obama administration, the birther movement, healthcare reform that was finally accomplished in the 21st century. And of course, we're dealing with on a continual basis, the effects of the victory of Donald Trump and its assumption of power as the president. We're also looking, and because we're dealing with these things, we're still looking at these events with fresh eyes. They're still contemporary, they're still well known, there's still a lot of feelings on them. I just don't discuss them in a historical sense. In a classroom setting, you would, in the course of the day, something will happen, somebody will have a question, you discuss these current topics, but you won't at least go through them historically, because they're still fresh, they're still relevant. So hit like, subscribe, and comment, and in our next lecture, I'll present my reflections on the course and that will be the end of our course on American history. As always, hit like, subscribe, and comment, and let me know what you thought about this lecture.